And in terms of the police department moving tonight, what was done at tonight's meeting?
The council officially approved moving the police department to the former Mid-State Technical College at 933 Michigan Avenue. It's adjacent to our current Parks and Recreation department.
And what's the reason they're moving?
Well, they've been in a basement for decades, and they have long since outgrown it. The facilities are just not adequate anymore. So they needed additional space. There's one spot where they actually have to leave the room to put gear on because the room isn't big enough. This will allow them adequate space, a little room to grow, and we may be able to even incorporate a couple of other things in there, perhaps municipal court.
And are there funds or anything that has to go into this? Does the city have to buy a building or anything?
Well,
for
no,
this?
we already own that building.
Okay.
So there will be funds that need to be expended, but it's really just for upgrades and security. I think there's a couple of additional doors and some minor remodeling that needs to go into effect. Building security is probably the biggest expense. And then in the future, we're looking at potentially putting in a sally port, which is a closed vehicle area.
And then, so how will this kind of better serve the city if the police department has a better facility?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, our officers are going to be able to do their job more effectively because they'll have adequate workspace and they won't have to worry about adapting. The second one is based on our calls for service. This location is actually a little more centrally located, so it would allow better response times should they be responding from the police department. Now they have to go back and do reports and things like that, so occasionally they do have to respond from the department, but other times they're out and about, but it's more centrally located.
And then sticking with the police department, the council also approved the addition of a police officer, is that right?
That is correct. So we've been short-staffed on just about every department for a while. Budgets just don't allow for that additional hiring. Every department needs more staff. We've made a few changes already, but the police department has been reduced in their drug officers. So what we're looking at doing is reestablishing that, and the police department has applied for a grant to help fund that position for the first 3 years. So the council approved that position contingent on receiving the grant. So if we don't receive that grant, we'll have to try and figure something else out. But if we receive the grant, the position is tentatively approved. Well, it's officially approved, I guess.
And has it been talked about what that could be if it's not approved, where the city would go for that?
We really haven't talked about that too much. I made mention that if they don't get the grant, it's going to be very hard to find an additional $45,000 or so in our operating budget because we're limited by what we can spend by the state. The state's had that restriction on local municipalities for quite a few years now, and I'd really wish they'd revisit that because it's becoming harder and harder for us to meet our needs and the needs of the residents with the restrictions that the state's put on us.
And when will you know if you've been approved for that grant?
We're hoping early October.